So another massive area for us has been AI, machine learning, and audit. Lots of people talked about when we did our original consultation, this idea that AI and machine learning might be really beneficial from an audit perspective, but people were also absolutely terrified of the concept of using machine learning. How do I use a tool that continues to learn? How do I use a tool that, I'm going to be honest with you, don't really understand? I hear AI, I think Terminator, I think Judgment Day. I don't think audit risk assessment. And so there's been a lot that we've been trying to do to think about, well, what can we say as an audit regulator to say to people, there's nothing in the ISAs that stop you using machine learning. Okay, we don't tell you to do it, but we're never going to tell you to do it. If you read the ISAs, they don't tell you every single bit of how to do an audit, every single stage. They set out principles. So one of the common issues is to say, well, what about a black box tool? I don't really know what's happening. Simple solution to that was, don't use a black box tool. Think about using intrinsically interpretable models. Think about using white box tools that are easier to understand, easier to develop, not easier to develop, it's kind of a misnomer, but different to develop. And maybe there are ways you can get around that. The other thing that we really thought about then was, who needs to understand what? And something we've been working on with the Turing Institute is what's we kind of started calling a hierarchy of understanding, which is the person using a machine learning tool to assess risk on a day-to-day in an audit needs to understand some things. They need to understand, to a degree, what the tool does, and they need to be able to justify its use in that audit. And that's the most important bit. For the person that's using that tool on a day-to-day basis, is it okay to use in this context? Do I have the right kind of data? Is the data in a good enough format? Probably not. But what can I do to the data to make sure that it's sensible? What about the engagement partner signing that audit off? Is it a reasonable expectation for us to say, well, you should understand how the algorithm was developed, how it was trained, what it actually does? Again, probably not. Again, justification, thinking about documentation. So who should understand it? And the answer is kind of, well, somebody should. So at the audit firm, for example, one of the models that we looked at is this idea that central specialists who help develop those tools should know all of those things. People that are using them on a day-to-day basis don't need to know all of those things, but they need to understand that somebody does. And I touched on this a little bit before, and that's governance. And there is an analogy here to sampling methodologies. The day-to-day auditor picking a sample and saying, I've looked at 50 invoices, that means that this accounts payable is fine. Do they actually understand the statistical model that's been used to pick that sample, or justify that 50 is enough? Probably not. I come from a kind of statsy background, so I probably couldn't do that. Lots of people I trained with definitely couldn't. But that was okay, because that methodology for taking a sample had been developed by the firm's central team, gone through an entire governance and testing process. So although person A on that day-to-day audit couldn't tell me what statistical model was used to justify a given sample size, they know that the process to get to that size is robust, it's well governed, it's thought about sensibly. And there is a parallel between that and how we think machine learning is probably most sensibly used in an audit firm. It's about saying, practically, who needs to know what, who needs to really understand the detail, and how do we get happy that the people that don't understand every minutiae of how the algorithm's been developed understand enough to make sure that it's used sensibly in the context that it is. And the tools that we've seen are incredibly interesting. One was looking at journals testing and how you could assess risk in journals. I mean, journals testing is an interesting one because there's been a whole lot of progress in lots of areas of audit. Journals testing is odd though, because it's still got some odd anachronisms where people pick journals and say, it's a round number posted on a Saturday, it's risky. Well, is it? What about if they've got a processing center overseas that works in different hours? Well, that journal on a Saturday morning makes sense in that context. So is going through a list of journals and saying what's round, what day was it posted on, really telling you much about risk? Probably not. But we've seen a really interesting tool that learns from the population, learns from a subset of the population, then looks at the rest of the population, and it identifies journals that are risky relative to that population. It says, this is the pattern for that population. This is what is weird for this one. And actually, it's very, very, very good at picking up weird little bits, particularly helpful when you're looking at fraud, particularly because I think over the years, a lot of people have thought, well, if I was going to do a fraudulent journal, I'll probably make it for a non-round number and I'll post it on a Tuesday and I'll probably get away with it. So there are lots of interesting tools from a risk assessment process. And really, it's about governance and it's about thinking about who knows what. So we're working on an example at the moment, which is, it's a kind of slightly different example for us at the FRC. We recently published some guidance on making professional judgments, which I don't know if anyone's seen. If not, happy to, again, point people in the right direction. So what we did is we developed a framework to say, if you're making a professional judgment, here's what mindset you should be using. Here's when you should think about consulting. So it doesn't tell people any rules, but it says this is a kind of framework for professional judgment. So what we're working on at the minute is an example that uses that professional judgment framework to tell a story about an auditor who's thinking about using a machine learning tool. What kind of things should they be thinking about? What kind of questions should they be asking internally? And how do they get happy that if they're the engagement partner, putting pen to paper, that the tool that they're using is leading to better results, but it's leading to better results in a way which is compliant with standards and leads to higher quality audit outcomes.